Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com, where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic we discuss here on the podcast. Overwhelmed by coverage of the recent events and the plight of asylum seekers, U.S. Representative Joaquin Castro of San Antonio began making dozens of calls recently, devising a plan to help. That's the topic of today's episode, where I'm speaking with San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau. And Silvia, before we begin, that immigration reporter title, that is a new position for you. So very quickly, why don't you tell us about how your life at the San Antonio Express News has recently changed?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Chance. So now I'm an immigration reporter. Before I was an education reporter, though, I believe on the podcast, I only talked about non-immigration related things. I also have been doing ongoing coverage of the Sutherland Springs community after the November church massacre. And then I also did a project or wrote a few articles about Puerto Rico post-hurricane. And that was also just kind of like a special side project because I'm half Puerto Rican. But I've been covering education apart from those two themes since I got here about a year and a half ago. And just a few weeks ago, I recently accepted the immigration position after one of our reporters moved to Seattle, the one who was covering immigration before. And yeah, this is I think I've only written 2 or 3 articles on immigration, so I hope you can bear with me a little bit. It's still new to me. Well,
congrats. This was not a way to point out your newness to immigration. No. And you're right. It is a little bit ironic. We spoke so much on In-Depth. You're probably our most frequent guest here on the program. And we, ironically, as I just mentioned, we're not speaking about education most of the time. So let's get into this topic that I briefly introduced a moment ago. There's been a lot in the news recently concerning migrant children. What are the major issues at play currently that have led to this public outcry many people, including myself, have been seeing from their friends on social media?
Yeah, so there's been kind of 3 main reports and kind of points of news that have snowballed on social media. So one of them is an ACLU report that was recently released, even though the actual documents that they released were between 2009 and 2014. And it basically found a lot of migrant child abuse allegations, abuses of migrant children by agents at U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, and also found that a lot of those allegations were largely swept under the rug. So that was one of them. They had like over 30,000 documents. It took them a while to get those records through an open records lawsuit. And so there's been like a large delay, I guess, in that because the documents, are from 2014 and we're just finding out about some of these now. But again, all of these cases are allegations. So, there were no actual findings in those allegations. And then we have 2 other issues. We have the issues of immigrant families being separated at the border. This is the result of a crackdown imposed by the Trump administration that is basically ramping up prosecutions of parents who are crossing the border illegally. They're now being prosecuted for entering illegally, and as such, are separated from their children. Their children are placed in a federal shelter system called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or often referred to as ORR. And then you have a third issue as well. One of the top officials within the Health and Human Services Department, which oversees the ORR, recently gave a report about the different migrant children and kind of going through the demographics, and mentioned that there were, out of a sampling of about 7,000 unaccompanied minors who were released from shelters into adult sponsor homes, there were 1,475 children who went unaccounted for. They didn't answer basically these well-being calls that were being given through a 3-month period last year. And so because they didn't answer, they were considered to have been lost track of in the system. So a lot of people, seized on this nearly 1,500 children, missing by the government. And so there are those three kind of separate issues that they are separate, but they did also get conflated online, I think, in some regards.
Yes, I think a lot of people have been seeing that lately. And this week you wrote that, quote, the public outcry reached a boiling point last week, likely due to the confluence of news reports and National Missing Children's Day, and that along with the debate came its frequent companion, misinformation. So now that we've kind of identified these three different related, kind of topics, tell me about how they all came together into this misinformation that has been taking place a lot in the past week or so.
Yeah, so I think people, even calling this 1,475 children that the government lost track of as missing could be slightly misleading. That number is based on well-being calls. So they're basically kind of checkup calls within this specific 3-month period of a sampling of children that is not representative of the total number of children that have been released from the shelters or that are currently in the shelter. So when you look at that, 1,475 out of 7,000, that's about 19%. It's possible that there are actually more children throughout the course of last year that didn't answer these well-being calls, but we really just don't know much about that. So did the government lose track of them? Yes, but these 1,475 children are part of a sampling of 7,000 that got these checkup calls. So if they just didn't call back or didn't follow through with the calls, then they would have been marked as missing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, they've been sold to human traffickers necessarily. So I think it's important to be kind of realistic about what that number means. People also conflated that number with the immigrant families that are separated from their children. So they've been saying, these children get separated from their families and then the government loses track of them. That's not the case. The nearly 1,500 missing children were unaccompanied minors released from the shelter. And this crackdown of immigrant families has happened more recently, mostly since the beginning of this year. And so you can't really connect the dots that smoothly, even though it might seem easy to do. Though it is important to point out, once these children are separated from their parents while their parents are going through criminal proceedings, they are essentially turned into unaccompanied minors and put in the federal shelter system and treated as if they had come over the border by themselves. And so something worth looking into is, how are these shelter systems now being overwhelmed with minors, with kids under 18, both who came across the border by themselves or who came with their parents but were then separated once they crossed.
And then to try to tie this back into how I introduced this topic at the beginning of the episode, for today's edition of the In-Depth podcast, how does the Where Are the Children and the city of San Antonio fit into all this?
Yeah, so the hashtag Where Are the Children spread over social media last weekend and really took off. It addresses, I think, all of the three news issues that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast: the separations, the unaccompanied minors that are unaccounted for, and the migrant child abuse allegations. Basically, since all of this news has kind of snowballed around the same time, it just really reached a tipping point and people were demanding, where are they and how are these migrant children being treated? And as a result of that, this kind of social media campaign launched, and U.S. Representative Joaquin Castro was really a prominent voice in that and made calls across the country and kind of became a pseudo community organizer. And from there, all of the immigrants' rights advocacy groups that do this on a regular basis have been involved. The American Civil Liberties Union have been involved, and cities across the country have been planning rallies, largely at the end of this week. So yesterday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, basically trying to raise awareness of the plight of migrant children, and also probably to propose solutions, much of which revolves around a rollback of the Trump administration's crackdown of these immigrant families. So in San Antonio, Thursday evening, which will be later tonight, there's a rally at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center to address this hashtag Where Are the Children movement. And so we'll have to see how that goes. I'm covering it tonight.
And so obviously real problems do exist, but we kind of started off the discussion talking about how the confluence of these three separate yet linked kind of areas have led to some people perhaps making assumptions and claims that weren't necessarily valid, at least from what we tell now. Do you think Where Are the Children at all has gotten tied into that? Or do you think that this campaign and what Representative Castro is doing is more focusing on what are the facts and trying to improve things? How do you find this campaign is related or not related to what we've been seeing on social media?
That's a good question. I think it is related to that kind of conflation of different issues. Where Are the Children, I think initially started about those 1,500 missing children, though as people found out more information about what that 1,500 number came from, I think this is just, observations from me online and talking to advocates, but I think they kind of shied away from making it just about that number because of the facts that I mentioned earlier. So now I think it's just about addressing immigrant families and children and their quality of life and what's happening to them when they reach the United States. A lot of people are also focusing especially on the families that are asylum seekers, which it's important to note, not everyone that comes across the border is seeking asylum. Many just are looking for work or for other purposes. But especially for asylum seekers, I think a lot of immigrant advocates are concerned that these people who are fleeing really a lot of civil unrest and a lot of bloodshed in their countries are now finding hardships in the United States, which they came here, looking for a refuge. So I think that's what the focus has kind of shifted or clarified to be. But I do want to point out too, the idea behind the Trump administration is that they think that immigrants are taking advantage of the immigration system through this asylum process. And so that's their reasoning for this crackdown. They're hoping that, people won't come to the United States trying to use this, quote, loophole to gain entry when they're actually not seeking asylum. And I think they're also they also hope that this kind of zero tolerance policy will deter more immigrants from coming across the border into the U.S.
Now, Silvia, that's a great segue. I wanted to give you specifically a little bit of time to talk about the change that has taken place from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, specifically with immigration and what you were just mentioning. So could you just generally talk about, obviously there are going to be changes in many different areas, let alone immigration from one White House to the next, especially when there are different parties. But what has happened from Obama to Trump concerning immigration and immigration issues?
Well, there have been a lot of concerns about the people who are coming to the U.S. who weren't born and raised here and who come through, particularly through the southern border. And so as early as later last year, immigrant families have begun this kind of crackdown on immigrant families has begun. And then just recently, earlier this month, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, announced this zero tolerance policy that basically doubled down on what they had already started doing, just clarifying that yes, immigrants who are crossing the border illegally are going to be prosecuted with a misdemeanor. And so they're going to have to go through criminal proceedings. And yes, that includes families who are seeking asylum. And that's kind of when immigrants' rights activists came in full force. I think they had been concerned with the rhetoric coming out of the administration when it came to immigrants and other people of color And then, especially after that announcement, I think people were pretty upset.
And then finally, Silvia, anything that we haven't covered yet, and also just a chance to kind of wrap things up, I want to ask you, well, how would you describe the current situation, with everything that we've discussed so far, and how that pivots into the future? Obviously, you just talked about the Trump administration. Do you perceive perhaps either continuing along the same lines, or perhaps even, if you will, doubling down on what they've already done? And then how does that affect immigration? And specifically, we're talking now about the children, and some reports that perhaps, reached a little bit too far. But at the core, there is an issue. There are problems with how these children are being treated and where they're going and whether or not they're being tracked here in the United States. How does all this look into the future for you?
I'm new to the beat, so it's hard for me to say for sure, what I think is going to keep happening. But I also, from speaking to other reporters, it seems like it's pretty uncharted territory for even, people who have been covering immigration for years. The Trump administration is just notoriously unpredictable. And with social media, I think it makes it even harder to pin down, I guess, what the new, what's coming next. I can't say, with more children separated from their families at the border, I think there's going to be an issue in ORR, the shelter system, with just more minors there. We've already seen last year, let's see, I have the numbers here. Last year, 40,810 children were referred to the shelter system. And then through March of this year, so, just the first 3 months, there have already been 21,000 children that have been referred. So we've already seen an uptick in children in these shelter systems. And so then I think the question is going to be, how are they going to handle this influx? Do we have the infrastructure in place to take care of these kids? And then also, what happens when we're trying to reunite these parents and children? If the parents end up being deported, or if they're granted asylum here, how do we track down these kids that were first separated and reunite them? Right now, it seems like there isn't a great infrastructure in place to ensure that the parents know where their kids are and are able to reunite with them once their proceedings are over. So those are all things I think I'll be looking into, and I think we can all expect to hear more about in the coming months and maybe even years.
And of course, you can find more information this week on expressnews.com with a story called Castro leads San Antonio and a growing number of cities rallying for migrant children. And that's brought to you by the San Antonio Express News' newest immigration reporter, Silvia Foster-Frau. So Silvia, great to have you back here on In-Depth. You're almost a co-host at this point, and I look forward to having you back on in the future.
Thank you, Chance. Appreciate it.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau for joining me for today's episode of In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Storland.